In the depths of the Ardennes winter, German forces suddenly pushed the U.S. Army into a strategic paradox, a small, encircled town that came to determine the fate of an entire front. Bastogne was not a major objective, not a capital, and not a critical fortress. Yet every road led to it, and every German thrust was forced to pass through it. Once Bastogne was sealed off in snow, the entire Allied plan risked falling out of rhythm. Inside the encirclement, American paratroopers waited for something that seemed impossible. An entire army would have to change direction, march through ice and snow, and arrive before everything collapsed. And that is exactly what happened. George S. Patton pivoted an entire army in just 72 hours to break the siege of Bastogne. While to the north, Bernard Montgomery, now responsible for coordinating the front, took nearly 2 weeks to launch his counteroffensive. 2 decisions, 2 tempos, and 2 fundamentally different ways of understanding war. What allowed Patton to move so fast that he shattered every logistical norm? And why did Montgomery choose a far more deliberate path? When a town cannot afford to wait, is it speed or control that ultimately decides the outcome of a war? By late 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared, on the surface, to be a downhill slope with only one direction left. German forces were suffering defeat after defeat, retreating from France, losing strategic initiative, their industry battered by bombing, fuel scarce, manpower depleted. After Normandy and the liberation of Paris, the Allies were pressing toward Germany's borders with the sense that the war had entered its logical endgame. Cross the Rhine, tighten the noose around Berlin, and bring everything to a close. But wars do not always die from their wounds. Sometimes they die in the final convulsion of a desperate body. Hitler understood this, and he gambled on something the Allies could not mass-produce. Surprise. Operation Wacht am Rhein was not designed to win through sustained strength. It was designed to win by striking the nervous system, driving through the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse, pushing toward Antwerp, splitting the Anglo-American alliance, crippling the logistics network, and, more importantly, shattering the belief that Germany was finished. It was the kind of plan that, if successful, history would call genius. If it failed, history would call it by its proper name: a gamble. And the Ardennes, in December 1944, was where that gamble was placed on the table. The Ardennes, with its dense forests, narrow roads, snow, and fog, was terrain the Allies had convinced themselves was quiet. But quiet in war is not a natural state. Sometimes it is a collective lie. In the early hours of the 16th of December 1944, that lie shattered as thousands of German guns opened fire at once. The artillery did not merely tear into the ground. It shattered the rhythm of the front. Within hours, a new reality took shape. Severed communications, delayed reports, American units cut off from their command structure, and a sky sealed by winter storms that nearly erased Allied air power from the battlefield. In those first days, the dominant feeling at Allied headquarters could be summed up in 3 words: surprise, chaos, and shock. German forces attacked wide and deep, driven by speed and by the belief that the Allies would respond according to habit. Pull back, wait for better weather, regroup, and only then, counterattack. But the Ardennes did not allow anyone to live by habit. Scattered American units, many of them new troops and reserves, fought back in desperation. Numerous forward positions collapsed quickly, creating a massive bulge on the front line. Yet within that swelling protrusion, a harsh rule of mobile warfare began to reveal itself. The deeper the advance, the longer the neck. And the longer the neck, the more easily a well-placed choke point could bend and eventually break the tempo of the attack. The Allies did not have an Ardennes wall. What they had were small pockets of resistance. And in war, small pockets can sometimes matter like steel locking pins. In the north, street, Vith and Elsenborn Ridge became stubborn choke points. In the south, the 110th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 28th Division, together with local Luxembourg forces, held off a much larger German force for 3 full days. Read from the distance of hindsight, those 3 days can seem like a minor detail. Lived on the battlefield, 3 days is a lifetime. It was enough time for Allied supply columns to begin redirecting, enough time for headquarters to recognize where the throat of the battle truly lay, enough time for a small town to be turned into a fortress before the encirclement closed. In other words, those 3 days formed the bridge between Germany can win through speed and Germany begins to lose because of its own speed. Everything gradually converged on Bastogne. Bastogne was not a capital, not an air base, not a political symbol, but on the Ardennes map, it was where 7 critical roads intersected. If you understand mobile warfare, the implication is immediate. 7 roads means 7 arteries. Tanks may be powerful, but they still require fuel, ammunition, food, repairs, and reinforcements. And all of that moves by road. Bastogne was therefore not just a tactical objective. It was the tempo gauge of the entire campaign. Germany wanted to seize it, to avoid detours, to eliminate the risk of a thorn embedded in its line of advance. The Allies wanted to hold it to turn the Ardennes bulge into something caught in the throat. The race to Bastogne was therefore existential from the very beginning. On December 19, a brigade of the 101st Airborne Division, together with remnants of the U.S. 10th Armored Division, reached the town just hours before the encirclement snapped shut. History often reduces that moment to a single line. They arrived in time. But what does in time actually mean? It means convoys driving through the night, along frozen roads, under broken warnings, with the risk of being cut off at any moment. It means paratroopers, trained to fall from the sky, now entering hell on wheels, carrying little artillery and limited anti-tank weapons, but bringing with them the one thing Bastogne needed most, the habit of not retreating. And when Bastogne was surrounded on the 20th of December, 1944, they understood that they had become the pin clamped between 2 opposing flows, one German current trying to surge toward the sea, and one Allied current determined to choke the gamble at its source. Inside the town, conditions quickly became a test of both morality and physical endurance. Ammunition was running low, the wounded were piling up, and bad weather shut down resupply and air support. German loudspeakers called for surrender. Bastogne answered with a single word: nuts. That word was both mockery and a cold admission that there was no way out. But Bastogne could not survive on slogans. Without an open corridor, no matter how defiant the reply, the encirclement would crush them according to the strict logic of war. No ammunition, no medicine, no strength, and no time. It was here that Bastogne ceased to be a town. It became the clock of the entire front. Who arrived first, and who arrived later, would determine the meaning of the entire Battle of the Bulge. At the same time, farther back from the fighting, Eisenhower studied the map and saw something even more dangerous than Bastogne itself. A German armored spearhead had pushed past the town and was closing in on the Meuse River. If German forces reached the Meuse in strength, the bulge could turn from a protrusion into a rupture. And once a rupture formed, the heroic stories unfolding in Bastogne could become strategically meaningless. Eisenhower was forced to do what any capable supreme commander must do in a crisis: restructure. He handed coordination of the northern sector, where disorder could quickly cascade into collapse, to Montgomery. He left the southern sector under the American command system led by Bradley. But in practical terms, the task of relieving Bastogne fell to Patton, who controlled the nearest mobile force. From that moment on, 2 tempos of war began to run side by side but out of sync. Montgomery entered the Ardennes like an engineer approaching a bridge that was already shaking. The first task was to stop the vibration, reinforce the structure, restore order, and only then think about counterattack. Patton entered the Ardennes, like a boxer who had just seen his opponent expose his chin. The first task was to strike immediately, before the opponent could pull back. One saw speed as a risk. The other saw speed as a weapon. And Bastogne lay between those two perspectives, like a patient bleeding out. One doctor wanted to stabilize the entire body before surgery. The other wanted to clamp the artery at once. Both approaches made sense. But a patient does not always give you time to choose. On December 19 inches, Verdun, Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to propose solutions to Hitler's blow. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, like a vigil awaiting bad news. Yet Ike forced his voice to remain steady. The situation, he insisted, was an opportunity, not a catastrophe. That line was not rhetorical polish. It was the way a supreme commander compelled the machine not to slip into a defensive state of mind. Because if the Allies responded only with fear, they would allow Germany to dictate the tempo. The problem was that large systems always prefer certainty. Most of the proposals leaned toward buying time, assemble forces, reorganize the front, wait for the weather. Some estimated that a major counteroffensive would not be possible until early January, and at that moment, Patton cut through the hesitation. With something war always demands, but few dare to say out loud. A time marker. Patton said he could attack within 48 hours. The room froze, not because anyone was unaware of Patton's tendency to speak boldly, but because everyone understood the cost of making such a claim. Pivoting an entire army is not the same as turning a division. It is the movement of hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition, all on roads that were frozen and congested. If Patton failed, he would not merely embarrass himself, he would cost the Allies a strategic opportunity. But Patton was not bluffing. He could say it because he had prepared. Because he believed that war does not forgive those who wait for perfect information. Patton and his staff had quietly drafted pivot plans the moment news broke of the Ardennes breakthrough. They did not wait for orders to start thinking. They thought in advance so that when orders came, they could move. That was what made the 72 hours possible. Not a miracle, but disciplined preparation. Eisenhower remained skeptical and asked Patton to push the timetable back to December 22 or 23 to ensure sufficient forces were in place. But the essential decision had already been made. Patton was given the green light. From that point on, the battle began to run on two clocks at once. One clock was counting down inside Bastogne. The other was counting forward along Patton's line of march. The gap between those two clocks was the distance between survival and annihilation, while in the north Montgomery began to stabilize the front. Pulling units back to defensible lines, constructing layered defenses, and restoring the chain of command, Patton launched his violent 90-degree pivot in the middle of a snowstorm. This was the moment when speed ceased to be an adjective and became a sequence of cold decisions. Patton drove his units day and night. He forced the logistics system to operate beyond its normal limits. He accepted the risks of traffic jams, broken vehicles, and exhaustion, because for him the greatest risk was that Bastogne might collapse before he arrived. Along the roads from Luxembourg into Belgium, American columns thundered forward like a river of steel. And if you look closely, what makes this speed truly frightening becomes clear. It was not fueled by excitement. It was fueled by discipline. Patton was present at the front, not to perform for effect, but to raise the tempo through the pressure of his presence. Soldiers shook less from the cold than from his gaze. In war, that is sometimes the only way to keep a massive machine from slowing itself down out of fear of making mistakes. But speed on the ground remained useless if the sky did not open. Bastogne, at that moment, was a fortress sealed both by land and by air. And this was the moment when the story took on its unmistakably cinematic quality. Patton asked for a weather prayer. It sounded like an aside, yet it captured a fundamental truth of modern war. There are bottlenecks that logistics cannot solve as long as the weather keeps the sky closed. On December 23, the clouds broke, and immediately, the tempo of the war changed. Supplies fell into Bastogne. Allied aircraft began striking German supply routes. The encirclement was no longer a sealed box. It became a box with a crack. And in war, a crack is where an army can force its way through. Patton selected the 4th Armored Division as the spearhead. From the south, Sherman tanks surged along narrow roads, cutting through villages and snow-covered forests where German anti-tank guns lay in wait. Bastogne was not relieved by a single clean punch. It was relieved through a series of fractures, each bone broken in turn. Every crossroads, every town, every stretch of road where a tank could burn and a man could die for stepping a single meter out of place. But Patton did not need the encirclement to vanish at once. He needed only to open a passage, a breathing tube, a lifeline. Because he understood that if Bastogne could survive past the breaking point, the entire German campaign would begin to lose its meaning. On the afternoon of the 26th of December 1944, the forward elements of American armor made contact with Bastogne at Assenois. That moment is often described as a reunion, but in strategic terms, it was the audible click of a trap unlocking. Bastogne could breathe. Patton had kept his 72-hour promise if measured from the start of the attack. And the countdown inside the town paused, not because danger had vanished, but because it had shifted from certain death by suffocation to the possibility of survival through an open supply route. Meanwhile, the clock in the north continued to run on Montgomery's rhythm. He kept the northern flank from breaking, restored order among shattered American units, and prepared for a major counteroffensive. For Montgomery, counterattack was not a matter of arriving in time, but of arriving in a way that ensured victory. He did not want to hurl his forces into a rushed blow that would spike casualties and fracture the formation. He wanted a push with structure, with artillery, with reserves, and with a clear plan. That was why his counteroffensive did not truly begin until early January. And it was this difference in timing that gave rise to the phrase, Montgomery arrived 2 weeks late. Not because he was absent from the Ardennes, but because his main offensive rhythm came after Patton had already performed the emergency work at Bastogne. If Montgomery is judged only through the word late, something far more important is missed. In reality, Patton's 72 hours and Montgomery's 2 weeks represent two ways of using time in the same war. Patton wielded time like a blade. The faster it moved, the sharper it cut. Montgomery used time like a wall. The more time he had, the thicker the wall became, and the fewer openings it left for tactical accidents. One accepted risk in order to seize the tempo. The other accepted delay in order to reduce risk. And Eisenhower, standing between them, used both approaches like two hands. One hand choking off Hitler's gamble through speed. The other, keeping the front from collapsing through control. That is why the Ardennes was not the victory of a single individual. It was the moment when two tempos were forced to coexist. Bastogne could not wait 2 weeks, which is why Patton had to arrive in 72 hours. But if the northern flank had collapsed, saving Bastogne would have meant saving a single point on a front that was already falling apart. Montgomery kept the front from breaking so that what Patton achieved could carry lasting strategic meaning. Throughout the Ardennes crisis, the core issue was not who was the better commander, but how time was to be used. And it is precisely here that Dwight D. Eisenhower emerges as the true, quiet, central figure. He was not the man pivoting armies through snowstorms, nor the one personally rebuilding shattered defensive lines. Eisenhower's role was subtler and harder to see, assigning time to the right man, in the right place. Eisenhower understood clearly that Patton and Montgomery were not two versions of the same kind of commander. They represented two fundamentally different approaches to war. One saw time as something to be broken the moment an opportunity appeared. The other saw time as something that had to be stretched in order to control risk. In most campaigns, that difference produced friction. In the Ardennes, Eisenhower had no choice but to use both, because the front itself was being torn in two by time. In the North, the problem was not winning quickly, but avoiding immediate defeat. American units were being pushed back, defensive lines were cracking, and the command system risked cascading into chaos. Here, any rushed decision could turn a counterattack into disaster. Eisenhower needed a slow tempo, one that allowed order to be restored, forces to be gathered, and the structure of the battlefield to be rebuilt. That was the tempo Montgomery knew best. Not the tempo of breakthrough, but the tempo of stabilization. Not to seize ground, but to prevent the front from collapsing. In the South, the logic was entirely different. Bastogne was not a problem that patience could solve. The town was being strangled, hour by hour. Here, time was not a resource to be managed, but an enemy to be defeated. If no corridor could be opened within a few days, every effort to stabilize the North would become meaningless, because the critical point would already be lost. Eisenhower understood that he needed a completely different tempo, the tempo of immediate action, and that was the tempo Patton was willing to accept and even to seek out. For that reason, when the crisis erupted, Eisenhower did not choose one man to do everything. He divided the front according to the nature of time itself. Montgomery was assigned to hold. Patton was assigned to break through. Not because one was better than the other, but because each was suited to a different timescale within the same war. One worked in the measure of weeks. The other worked in the measure of hours. The meeting at Verdun on December 19 was not where Eisenhower searched for a perfect plan. It was where he searched for a commitment to time. Most proposals revolved around waiting, preparing, stabilizing. Those ideas were not wrong, but they belonged to Montgomery's tempo. And while that tempo was necessary for the entire front, it could not save Bastogne. Patton was the only one who offered a timeline appropriate to the burning problem at hand. Dozens of hours, not weeks. Eisenhower was skeptical and even asked for adjustments. But he understood that what mattered most was not the precise number, but the willingness to accept risk in exchange for speed, and he gave Patton the authority to try. Once those two decisions were made, the Ardennes began to operate deliberately on two different tempos. In the North, the front was compressed, gradually brought under control, and risks were suppressed before they could spread. In the South, an entire army was forced to run beyond its limits, trading logistical safety for hours of survival for Bastogne. Eisenhower did not attempt to synchronize those tempos. He allowed them to exist side by side, because he understood that if he forced them to move at the same speed, both would fail. When a corridor into Bastogne was opened after 72 hours of attack, the emergency tempo had completed its task. But that did not mean the campaign was over. From that moment on, the tempo of control began to exert its full effect. The counteroffensive in the North no longer needed to be fast. It needed to be solid. And when that counteroffensive unfolded in early January, it did so on a front that had been kept from collapsing, with Bastogne still in Allied hands. It was this sequence of two tempos that transformed a daring relief operation into a complete strategic victory. The tensions that emerged afterward between Patton and Montgomery reflected, in part, their fundamentally different views of time. The exchanges of words, the controversial press conferences, the collisions of ego were not merely personal disputes. They were the natural consequence of two men accustomed to working on different timescales being forced to coexist within a shared victory. When Montgomery emphasized the importance of stability, many Americans felt that the effort of the most critical days had been diminished. When Patton was celebrated for speed, those who favored caution felt that the risks he took were being overlooked. Eisenhower was compelled to stand between them, not to decide who was right or wrong, but to keep the victory from being torn apart by competing interpretations of it. For Eisenhower, the lesson of the Ardennes was not about who arrived in time and who arrived late. It was about the impossibility of using a single kind of time for every problem. There are moments in war that demand immediate action, regardless of risk. There are other phases that require cold patience, regardless of pressure. Victory emerges only when those two kinds of time are placed in the right positions, and when the right people are entrusted with the authority to use them. Seen in that light, Eisenhower was not a figure who overshadowed Patton or Montgomery. He was the one who ensured that 72 hours of emergency action and 2 weeks of control did not cancel each other out. Patton broke the encirclement before Bastogne could die from time itself. Montgomery kept the front from dying of chaos, and it was precisely that division of roles that left Hitler's final gamble with no space left in which to survive. On the snow-covered fields of Bastogne, at the end of 1944, history witnessed a moment of acute tension in which modern war posed its central dilemma: speed or solidity, risk or control. Patton, with his operational brilliance and a measure of audacity, chose speed, and he saved Bastogne by the narrowest margin. Montgomery, through calm restraint and caution, chose control, and he helped ensure that the ultimate victory did not turn into a reckless gamble. The victory at Bastogne, therefore, was not only a story of miraculous speed, but also a story of strategic balance. The later course of the Second World War would prove that both command styles had their place. New Pattons would emerge with steel spearheads driving deep into enemy lines, and they would still require new Montgomerys to hold what had been taken and secure the rear. In the Normandy campaign, Montgomery planned D-Day with precision, but it was the relentless momentum of American commanders in the mold of Patton that swept German forces from France. On another front, the Soviet Red Army likewise combined rapid thrusts in the style of Zhukov with firm defensive structures associated with commanders like Konev to drive back the Wehrmacht. In other words, modern war is an interweaving of bold leaps forward and deliberate pauses built to last. As for Patton and Montgomery themselves, fate ensured that they never truly understood one another. Yet history required both. Eisenhower often found himself exasperated by two subordinates who could hardly tolerate each other. But in the end, he possessed a perfectly balanced pair of offense and defense. Bastogne stands as the clearest proof of that balance. One side charging forward to break the siege, the other quietly holding the line. Patton's 72 hours of speed saved the situation, but Montgomery's 2 weeks of methodical control ensured that the victory was secured and brought to completion. War is the art of choice, and sometimes the right choice is not an extreme, but the ability to combine two forces that appear to oppose each other. Bastogne was saved not only by the steel tracks of Patton's tanks, but also by Montgomery's cold judgment that kept the larger situation from spinning out of control. Amid the smoke and fire of the Ardennes, these commanders demonstrated that speed can decide a battle, but stability decides the long war. Patton saved Bastogne in 72 hours. Montgomery arrived 2 weeks later. The story carries the tension of contrast, yet its conclusion is a shared victory. That victory offers a lasting lesson. In modern war, commanders are constantly torn between striking fast to seize the moment and advancing carefully to preserve their forces. Every situation demands a different answer, and true mastery lies in recognizing the correct answer at the decisive moment. The Battle of Bastogne closed with the cheers of American paratroopers and the collective exhale of an entire front. Patton accomplished what seemed impossible. Montgomery ensured what seemed unbreakable. The 2 weeks that separated them reflected a difference in style, but in the end, both arrived at the same destination: victory. It was the fusion of risk and control, of speed and solidity, that defines the art of modern warfare and continues to hold its meaning today.